Well, thank you so much for clicking on this video. Tuesdays with Thomas is my effort to learn a little bit more about Thomas Aquinas by sharing what I'm reading with anyone who happens to click onto these YouTube links. And in today's video, what we're going to talk about is the third of Thomas's 5 ways to prove the existence of God. Thomas's third way. From my reading, I have learned that this is, in a lot of ways, the most controversial and misunderstood of Thomas's 5 ways. Even among those who ordinarily are big fans of Thomas Aquinas, there is some dispute as to whether this proof is valid. I hope to make the case in today's video that this is indeed a proof well worth considering. So let's just get right to it. Here's how Aquinas starts. He says, the third way is taken from possibility and necessity, and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. Now, I think that the reason that this proof is often misunderstood is because of the translation of the word possible. In our vernacular, the word possible usually carries with it the idea of logical possibility, some world in which it's logically possible that something happened or something exists. But that is not the sense in which Thomas is using this expression here in this third way. So what does he mean? Well, remember that these ways are summaries, and that Thomas, I think, expects and assumes that those who read them will have some background in philosophy, especially the philosophy of Aristotle. And it's in one of Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle's philosophical works, a work of Aristotle's on the heavens, that Aquinas talks at length about what he means by the words possible and impossible. And basically, if we wanted to capture one English word to capture the idea of what he means by possible, I think the idea would be temporary. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's what he says in his commentary on Aristotle's work on the heavens. He says, it should be noted that as the philosopher, that's what he always calls Aristotle, says in one of his other works, possible and impossible are said in one way absolutely, namely, because in themselves they can be true or cannot be true by reason of the relationship existing between the terms. Or in other words, that's the sense of using the words possible and impossible in the sense of logically possible or impossible. But then he says, in another way, a thing is said to be possible or impossible to something, namely, what it is able for with respect to its active or passive power. And it is in this sense that possible and impossible are taken here, namely as what is or is not within the power of an agent or patient. For this is the meaning that is most appropriate to natural things. In other words, by possible, Aquinas means given the nature of something. Some things are possible given their nature as that which can be generated and corrupted. So by possible, Aquinas isn't talking about the range of logical options. He's talking about what is possible in view of the inherent nature of things. Given the fact that birds are born and die, they're generated and corrupted, they are possible creatures, possible to be and not be. Given the fact that flowers grow and die, they're generated and corrupted, they are possible creatures in this sense, creatures that are possible to be and not to be. So just to emphasize, in this understanding of the word possible, what is at issue is not what is logically possible. It's not that Aquinas is saying, well, there could have been such a thing as birds or not. There could have been such a thing as flowers or not. No, the issue is not what could have been, but what actually is. Look again at how this starts. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. And the reason some things in the natural world are possible to be and not to be is because they are generated and corrupted. So for our purposes, we might substitute the word possible with the word temporary. So let's read the first part of the proof like this. We find in nature things that are temporary, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are temporary. Flowers sprout and flowers wilt. They are temporary, possible to be and not be in the sense of the argument. People are born and people die. We are temporary, possible to be and not be in the sense of the argument. With this in mind, it'll be easy to understand the next sentence in the argument. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Now read this with our substitution. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is temporary at some time is not. By definition, something temporary exists only for a period of time. At other times, it doesn't exist. Well, the next step in the argument rests on a hypothetical. What if everything is temporary? So he says this. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. If everything is possible not to be, temporary, then Thomas says at one time there could be nothing that exists. Now, it's this sentence that probably creates more confusion than any other for two reasons. First of all, it's sometimes rendered could. There could have been nothing in existence. And to our modern ears, it sounds like Thomas is saying this might have been the case. But that's not what he's saying. Other translations make the meaning clearer. Aquinas is much more emphatic. He is saying that if everything was temporary, then once upon a time there was nothing. But this raises a second and more substantial confusion. Why does Aquinas assume that if everything was temporary, then at some point in time, nothing would exist? And the reason is because Thomas has left unstated here a crucial premise. Namely, he is granting, for the sake of argument, an infinite amount of past time. And we know that this is the case because when you consult his detailed explanation of this terminology, in that commentary on Aristotle's work I previously referenced, you can see him make this explicit. Look at what he says here. Hence, Aristotle says that it is plainly impossible for something destructible not to be at some time destroyed. Because if it will not be destroyed at some time, it has the power not to be destroyed, and thus will be indestructible. And yet it is assumed to be a destructible thing existing for an infinite time. Consequently, it will be always, that is, for an infinite time, simultaneously, actually destructible and indestructible. So, playing off of Aristotle, while Aquinas is saying this, if something is temporary, then given enough time, it will cease to exist, by definition. Well, if everything is temporary, given enough time, everything will cease to exist. And infinite past time is certainly enough time to grant that, and so therefore everything would have ceased to exist. Now, why is Aquinas willing to grant infinite past time? I think it's because Aristotle was willing to grant infinite past time, to believe that the world had always existed. Well, now this leads to another question then. Could everything be temporary? So continuing now in the third way, Aquinas says this. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. This is a restatement of one of the premises in the second way. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. So if everything is temporary, that would mean that in an infinite past, everything would have ceased to exist. There would be nothing. But if that is the case, there would be nothing in existence right now, because from nothing, nothing comes. Moving on. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, and thus even now nothing would be in existence, which he says is absurd. So you see the logic here. If everything was temporary, given an infinite past, everything would have eventually ceased to exist. But if everything ceased to exist in the past, what exists now would have come from nothing, and that's an absurdity. Therefore, Thomas says, not all beings are merely possible or temporary, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. At this point, you might think that Aquinas is ready to declare victory with his famous, "and this all men call God," but not so fast. Thomas has reason to believe that there are some things that won't go out of existence, that aren't temporary, that are necessary, but they aren't God. So necessary basically means something that is not temporary. What are some things that Aquinas would believe that are necessary? That is to say, they're not temporary, but they're not God. Well, one possibility is angels, who are immortal, but they are not God. Philosophically, Aquinas would have even granted the theoretical notion that the world would not go out of existence. So there's still something else to add to the concept of necessary to get to the idea of God. And here is what that is. He says, "But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not." So thinking about it like this, flowers are temporary. They are generated and they are corrupted. Angels are not temporary. They are necessary in the sense Aquinas is talking about here. They are not going to go out of existence. But they still rely on God for their existence. They possess necessity, but not inherently. They are not temporary, they're everlasting, but that is derived from God. Their necessity is caused by another. So both the flowers and the angels still ultimately rely on God. Even the necessity of the angels relies ultimately on God. And this should remind you then of the second way, because you start to now see another one of these chains of causes that need causes. These necessary things that still must derive their existence from something else. And so Thomas goes on to say this: "Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes." So remember, Thomas said the options were a necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. And an infinite series of caused causes is impossible. So that must mean there is a necessary being who does not derive its necessity from anything else. Therefore, he says, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. So I want to conclude by restating this argument in terms of another work of Aquinas called On Being and Essence. So to understand this argument, let me ask you this question. What are the essential characteristics of Santa Claus? You might say chubby, white beard, red clothing, and gifts. We know his essential features, his essence. But, spoiler alert, he does not exist, which means that essence and existence are two different things. So with that in mind, consider that essence is what something is, existence is that something is. Santa Claus has essence, but not existence. So then consider this argument. Number one, essence and existence are distinct. In some cases, they have never been combined, like Santa Claus, and in other cases, they were once combined but aren't any longer, like dead flowers. Number two, for something to be real, they must be combined right now. Essence and existence must be combined right at this very moment for something to be real. This is what undergirds Thomas's argument in the third way when he talks about things that of their nature are generated and corrupted. There's nothing inherent in the nature of material things that keeps their essence and existence combined. They are inherently temporary, in fact. Number three, that which is combined requires a combiner. Number four, the combiner would also require something to combine its essence and existence right now. Well, this chain of beings needing essence and existence combined would only derive reality from something whose essence simply is existence. Can you think of any description of God in the Bible which portrays his essence as simply his existence? How about this description? I am who I am. Exodus 3:14. In other words, God does not need anyone to combine his essence with existence. His essence simply is his existence. He is the necessary being that does not derive necessity from anyone else. And no wonder then Thomas ends the third way by saying, this all men speak of as God.